Millfield's abandoned church had been empty for years. Swallows in the rafters, mice in the hymnals. Winters so hard the stained glass crazed with frost. Yet the wood beneath the ornately carved pulpit was unworn, almost tender to the touch. When Joseph Harkins slid his chisel into the seam, the platform gave with a sigh and rose on a hidden counterweight. Inside, the compartment smelled of tallow and old thunder. He found a leather-bound book, the skin gone gray with age, its spine creaking like a door. The ink was steady. The hand never wavered. Name after name after name, dates, places, causes, and most obscene, tidy columns of numbers, acreage, livestock, estimated yields, resale prospects. A ledger of the dead that balanced perfectly. Beneath it lay 15 hand-drawn maps: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Each bore the same neat title in the same devout script, the Promised Land. And each was marked not with blessings but with cautions. Swamps that hummed with summer fever, floodplains that swallowed spring, clay soils that turned to brick in drought. Margins noted mortality by season, as if weather were a scythe one could schedule. Harkin's hands shook so hard he could hardly close the book. "It's a business ledger," he whispered to no one. "Lives priced." By dusk, the sheriff had locked the evidence in his office. By dawn, the cabinet stood open and empty, its key still warm on the desk. 3 days later, he was dead in his bed with his eyes wide to some private terror. Men say it was his heart. His deputy resigned and rode west without luggage or goodbye. The rumor had lived in Ohio for 30 years, long enough to acquire moss and teeth. The Westbrook brothers, Isaiah the voice, Daniel the mind, Samuel the hand. They walked out of the Second Great Awakening the way men step out of a river, slick with conviction and cold as steel. Revival had remade the frontier into a chorus of tents and torches, a wilderness cathedral where voices rose until even the skeptics felt their ribs tremble. Who could tell the true fire from the fever in such a season? When Isaiah Westbrook first spoke in Chillicothe in 1803, people said he could make a quarrel settle and a baby sleep with the same sentence. He was tall enough to seem chosen, bearded like an engraving of an Old Testament patriarch, and blessed with a voice that struck the farthest listener gently, as if with the palm rather than the fist. "God has shown me a new Jerusalem in this Ohio country," he cried on a humid afternoon, and some who had come to sell eggs left their baskets and wept into their shawls. They built him a church at Millfield, a modest wooden house with a pulpit raised a little higher than was strictly necessary. The carving on the rail curled like vines. Isaiah's brothers stood below him whenever he preached. Daniel, bookish and spare, had a manner that made illiterate men feel as if they were briefly learned. He wrote pamphlets dense enough to be respectably dull to outsiders and thrilling to the faithful, laced with phrases that made obedience sound like courage. Samuel youngest kept his counsel and his accounts. His hands were always clean. That winter the prophet, he did not call himself that yet, but others did, declared a vision, land 30 miles distant, sanctified, purchased, prepared. He called it a promised land and spoke of honey and shade. The tract lay in a bend of the Hocking where summer gathers in the grass and hums, low ground with a memory of fever. People who had tried to farm there warned softly and were ignored loudly. "Doubt is the devil's grammar," Isaiah preached, and his congregation nodded like wheat in wind. 47 families went. They sold town lots, packed heirlooms into crates, and followed Isaiah's wagon until the forest opened and the marsh began. He stayed long enough to bless the huts and name the lanes, and then rode back to Millfield to guide more pilgrims. In June, the first child burned with malaria. By August, there were more graves than chimneys. A woman named Elizabeth Winters kept a diary in a schoolgirl's hand that stiffened as the months wore on. Samuel visits each grave with his ledger, writing as if he were recording births instead of deaths. There is something unnatural in such precision. When the frost finally put out the mosquitoes, half of the settlement had been carried out in sheets. Those who could walk away walked away. The Westbrooks mourned beautifully. Isaiah took to the pulpit and let his voice break in the right places. He spoke of purification through trial, of Abraham and wilderness and crowns laid up in a world not made with hands. In the back pews, where the poor sat, the bereaved stared and tried to arrange their faces into gratitude. Meanwhile, Samuel reclaimed the land by clause and covenant, the way a man draws a net tight. Abandonment forfeited title to the church, and the church, for legal purposes, was Samuel. He waited a year, sometimes two, for memory and rumor to thin, then sold the parcels to timbermen who did not ask questions of ghosts. Once they understood that despair could be monetized, the brothers refined the design. The second promised land sat near a river that rose deceptively late each spring and erased seed and hope in the same brown bloom. The seventh had soil that looked black and loamy until August, when it set like pottery and spat out roots. Each site was chosen for a flaw that could pass as providence until the moment it became doom. Daniel's theology kept pace with the map work. He wrote on progressive revelation, the divine right to new instructions, and on covenants of faith that were, beneath their swaddling of Scripture, legal instruments. If a believer died without heirs within the fold, or if he departed from the fellowship, his land returned to the ministry for the furtherance of the work. Several hundred parcels changed hands that way in a handful of years. The ledgers sang of it, neat, antiseptic, grateful columns. Prosperity arrived in public. The church in Columbus rose out of limestone like a statement. Its steeple lifted a finger miles into the clear air, and travelers asked what city this was, that it required pointing heaven out so emphatically. Isaiah wore better cloth. Daniel published books thick enough to stop doors. Samuel built an estate outside Cincinnati with shutters that would not rattle even in a January gale. Beneath the furnishings lay the same floorboard as ever. Ledgers upon ledgers, maps upon maps, a faith grafted to a balance sheet. If the brothers had been a little less sure of themselves, if their luck had held one season longer, they might have died in their beds. Instead, a cousin came calling. Martha Collins arrived from Boston in the spring of 1838 to visit a kinswoman newly devoted to the Westbrooks church. She had her father's eye for a contract and the patience to sit through a sermon without making a face. In Columbus, she saw expensive glass and inexpensive mercy. She watched how Isaiah's selections for new settlements tended to fall on families who had recently converted assets into cash, on widows and men with few kin, on immigrants with accents thick enough to slow their claims. She said nothing, only smiled and offered to help with copying in Daniel's study. Words open doors. Politeness opens drawers. One afternoon, she found a small cabinet with an unnecessary lock, and, by a combination of luck and Emma's trust, opened it. The maps inside were the twins of those uncovered long afterward in Millfield. Topography annotated with slow murder. The papers beneath recorded deaths with the same dispassion as rainfall amounts. Property values upgraded as heirs thinned. The future of each settlement expressed as a percentage that would have made any investor's heart glad and any decent man sick. There was even a document on selection criteria. Cool as a recipe. Assets. Likelihood of extended family interference, susceptibility to rhetoric. She copied until her fingers cramped, hiding the pages in a hollow Bible and sleeping with it under her pillow as if Gideon's blade lay inside. She meant to run. She meant to board a coach east and deliver the papers to her father, who knew men in Washington whose signatures altered the world. But she began to feel watched, the extra smile from a deacon's wife, the unblinking gentleman at the market stall, the invitation from Isaiah to a private prayer. On the night she went to the station, two men approached her quietly, as if for kindness, and guided her into a church carriage. The coachman's ledger noted nothing unusual. The horse jingled as it moved off, church paint gleaming dully in the lamplight. After that silence, her father came all the same. William Collins had the look of a man who has outlived softer versions of himself. He lodged at the inn in Columbus and hired detectives the way other men hired carpenters. Money talks louder than grace. Inside the church walls, Jacob Miller, deacon, grandfather, suddenly a man whose grief had teeth, began to listen. He had buried his daughter and two grandchildren in a Westbrook cemetery with consecrated boards and a bill. One afternoon, he overheard Samuel mention that the Collins problem had been solved as the Peterson affair had been solved in '29, and something in him that had endured snapped. Miller told Collins about a master book, the accounting, hidden beneath the Millfield pulpit, the one Harkins would pry up years later, and about wagons that went out at night when rumors ripened. He swore out a statement and got it notarized. Governor Shannon authorized a discreet operation. Word leaked from an office where the church kept a hand on a shoulder and a favor in a drawer. Fires began before the warrants were signed. In Cincinnati, Samuel loaded trunks and burned the scrap that wouldn't fit. In Columbus, Daniel's study windows glowed until long after midnight, and the smoke smelled not of wood. Isaiah rode to Millfield himself to lift the pulpit like a lid and take the book that made sense of all the others. A sheriff met him there, tipped off by a friend whose faith had reached the end of what it could forgive. 2 men died in a scuffle that felt like blasphemy in a sanctuary. Isaiah was wounded. Nothing fatal, only enough to remind him he bled and escaped with the ledger under his coat. The brothers and 60 loyalists fled south as winter broke, leaving debts and ashes and congregations suddenly, startlingly alone with their own eyes. By Natchez they were quarreling. Isaiah prayed until the words came out hoarse and raw. Daniel slept and woke to laudanum and diary scraps. Samuel watched the river and weighed his brothers the way a trader weighs meat. At a landing thick with mud and promises, he slipped away with most of the remaining cash and an expression no one who loved him had seen before. Isaiah and Daniel went on to New Orleans where, a week later, 2 men who looked like merchants and moved like soldiers killed them near the docks in a quarrel about nothing. Witnesses told stories afterward, of Isaiah dying with a small red book clutched to his chest, of his last words, not prayer but stubborn pride. Our work is recorded in heaven. You cannot erase it. Samuel dissolved into rumor. Brazil's police arrested a man named Samuel West in 1847 for running a fraudulent colony. He died conveniently, and his confiscated journal contained thoughts too familiar to be coincidence. Perhaps he made it farther. Men like him often do. When the waters fell and the mouths opened, the state passed laws with the brothers' shadow baked into their clauses. Regulations on religious landholdings, transparency for covenants, a distinction between offerings and conveyances. Some of the promised lands lay fallow for decades, too loud with the memory of mosquitoes and sermon and shovel to be hospitable. Farmers plowing near Logan turned up a pit of bones that had once been children. No one tried to name them all. In an office in Columbus, an old locket surfaced with a miniature of a woman whose eyes might have been Martha's or anyone's. Somewhere in Europe, a collector perhaps, shelved a red book with brass corners and wondered at the calmness of the hand. The true horror was never only the deaths. It was the ease with which trust can be tithed, the way a pulpit can be a counting house if you raise it high enough. The Westbrooks did not invent exploitation. They refined it to an instrument that could be played in any key. Their genius was simple and unforgivable. Find land that looks like hope and acts like a trap. Call it holy. Sell it dear. Inherit the wreckage. In a century that prized freedom of worship, they learned to hide a blade in the privilege and keep it sharp. Long after the smoke cleared, you could still hear their theology echoing in other meeting houses, thinner and less dangerous but recognizably kin, a prophet with a timetable, a covenant that looks like devotion and reads like a deed, a settlement named for heaven built on ground that won't grow anything but grief. And in archives, between letters that smell of starch and mold, you find the names again, written so neatly they almost look cared for. If you stand in Millfield at dusk, when swallows dip and the light goes to parchment, you can see the rectangle where the pulpit sat. The floorboards there are new now, the grain pale and honest. But if you kneel, if you put your ear to the wood and listen hard enough, you might hear the scratch of a steady hand, a page turned, a column added, the soft arithmetic of a man who believed in 2 ledgers. One he kept, and one he presumed God would balance for him.